Welcome to MyLife, Chassidus Applied, episode 50. This episode is dedicated to Yosef Yitzchak ben Bracha for refuah, shleimah. If you'd like to dedicate future episodes, please go to meaningfullife.com/MyLifeLive/dedicate. If you'd like to submit a question in our forum, which is anonymous and confidential, the same is meaningfullife.com/MyLifeLive. Being that we are in the beginning of Parsha Shemos and transitioning from Parsha Vayechi, the end of Sefer Bereshis, and opening up a new Sefer Shemos called Sefer HaGeula by the Ramban, let me share a few words from Chassidus on this topic, especially from the Rebbe's Siches. In Teres Chaim, the Rebbe, Mittler Rebbe, explains that Sefer Bereshis is different than all the other four Sfarim in Chumash. Sefer HaYashar it's called, because it's the story of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, the Yesharim. And he explains in a beautiful way that Bereshis, in a sense, is like the blueprint which lays out all the resources and the entire map of Seder Ishtalshelus. And in truth, the Torah really begins from Sefer Shemos. Even Rashi alludes to it by saying that the Torah should have actually began with HaChedesh Hazel Lachem, which is in Shemos, by Yetzias Mitzrayim, the first mitzvah of Kiddush Levana, but because Keach Am of Higud La'ame, the Eibishter wanted to begin by saying Bereshis bara Elokim. So in essence, the story of the Jewish people really begins in Sefer Shemos. Ve'ela Shemos b'nei Yisrael, Haboyim Mitzrayim, the descent into Mitzrayim, the Golus, and from there begins the journey that would be after the Golus Mitzrayim, which is 2.5 chapters. The rest of the Torah is all 40 years. The 40 years that Moshe led the Jewish people to Eretz Yisrael. So if you think about it, actually, almost 4/5 of the Torah occupies 40 years. And Sefer Bereshis is almost 2,000 years. So the Mittler Rebbe explains, because Sefer Bereshis is like a Haggadah, where we get all the resources, all the keiches. Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov is Chesed, Gvur, and Teferes. He explains it at length in Teres Chaim. And Shemos is now empowered to enter into Mitzrayim, into Golus, where life really begins. And the Torah really begins its story in the sense of its interaction with the world in which we live. Obviously, there's not only lessons, and it's part of Torah, the Sefer Bereshis, and there are lessons in our personal lives. But in the big scheme of things, the first Sefer is that type of like Klolizdike Sefer HaYashar. With that said, we can say that at the end of Parsha Shemos, therefore, at the end of Parsha Vayechi, before we go into Sefer Shemos, as the Rebbe explains in the Sikha 28 years ago, the year of Hey Tevis became a Yontiv, that Parsha Vayechi, a Meredike Sikha, the Rebbe asked the question, how do we say Chazak v'nis Chazek, when the last pasuk in Chumash is Vayomas Yosef b'meya v'eser shanim vayachnu to Esei vayisim ba'orim b'mitzrayim? It's a negative thing. And the Rebbe explains, Adarabbe, that Yosef remaining in Mitzrayim, not like Yaakov who was taken to Eretz Yisrael, gives the Eden chizuk, Chazak v'nis Chazek, that all the years they were in Mitzrayim, they knew that Yosef is there with them, the Yosef of the generation, and that he would ultimately, as they would be redeemed, he would be redeemed with them, as he said in the pasuk before that, Vayishba Yosef, Poked Yifked, Elikim Eschem, Valisim Es Atzmeisei Mezeh, and the Rebbe's medayik the word Atzmeisei, the Atzmus of Yosef. In a Sikhe, in Tov Shin Nun, when it was 110 years from Tov Reish Mem, when the Frierdiker Rebbe became 110, 110 years from his birthday, so in Parshat Bolok, Tov Shin Nun, it's a beautiful sikha about Me'eh ve'esrim Shana, how the Rebbe says that indicates a nitzchis. The nitzchis of Yosef, who was zeichet, not like all other shvatim, were not zeichet to see grandchildren and great-grandchildren, like it says before in the pasuk, b'nei shileshim, and so on. Now, all this leads us into what? Into the next dor. What's the dor after Yosef? So the Yosef Shebederenu, as the Rebbe explains in that Vayechi sikha, and as well as in the Bolok sikha, is the Frierdiker Rebbe, named Yosef Yitzchak. And Keneged, which Sfira do you correspond to? Yosef, as the Rebbe explains there. And that leads into Malchus. Malchus is Yedid and Biyah. Malchus is the Deir HaShvi. So after the generation of Yosef comes the next generation which enters into Mitzrayim, into Golus Mitzrayim. Now empowered with Yosef, who was Mamshech all the Eris of Atzilus, of Avram, Yitzchak, Yankov. Yosef is Yesod. That's Mamshech everything into Malchus. But Malchus is the Deir HaShvi, which is the Deir HaShvi, the Deir of Moshe Rabbeinu. As the Rebbe explains, the Frierdiker Rebbe explains in the Bosel Legani, famous Bosel Legani Yuchvat Maimer, from the Medrash, that Moshe was the seventh generation from Avram Avinu. And the Rebbe, in his first Maimer, Bosel Legani Tavshin Yerav, that our generation, after the Frierdiker Rebbe, is the Deir HaShvi from the Alter Rebbe. So the application, Chassidus Applied, of these parshas couldn't be more relevant in the sense that we go over from Sefer Bereshis to Sefer Shemos, that we're going from the Deir HaShisha, Yosef, we're going into the Deir HaShvi, which enters Mitzrayim. But as the Rebbe also promised us and tells us, the Deir HaShvi, like Moshe Rabbeinu, took the Eden out of Mitzrayim. The same thing in this Deir HaShvi is Kimet Seischem Eretz Mitzrayim Aren and Neflos, that this will be the Deir that brings V'shachanti B'seichem, as Moshe did it then. He brought the Shekhinah down to earth after it was nostalgic 7 generations, and Avram brought it down from 7th heaven to the 6th, and Yosef brought it from the 6th, from the 5th heaven, from the 2nd heaven to the 1st. What does Moshe the Deir HaShvi do? He brings it down into on the Oreb Shechanti B'Seichem here on this earth, and the same will be now in the Gula Amitis V'Shleimah. So we are empowered in the language of Chassidus. The Ovis are Atzilus. Chesed Gvura the Feres, the Atzilus is Avram, Yitzchak, Yankov, Hein Merkava, Ovis Hein Merkava. Their entire role was bittul, setting the tone, setting the stage for what? For what would come in Sefer Shmeis, where the real Torah begins in the sense of Yetzias Mitzrayim, Kriyas Yamsuf, and above all Matan Torah and the building of the Mishkan. And then the journey continues until the end of Chumash. The next books are all about the journey. The journey, of course, ends in Parsha Maseh. But Devarim repeats it all until the last point when Moshe Rabbeinu does not enter Eretz Yisrael, right at the border, right at the Saf HaGeula, at the threshold of entering into the Promised Land. The relevance today, as I said, is obvious. This is where we stand today. And Shemos, this transition from Vayechi to Shemos, is that lesson. So, in the context of Chassidus Applied, MyLife Chassidus Applied, it comes down to what is our job? Our job is the Rebbe marked and said many times, is Yefutza Meinesecha Chutza, to finish the last steps. Even if the Rebbe says we finished, we already polished the buttons, etc., but still we have to open our eyes. We have to open up the world's eyes. Even everything is ready, but it's our job is to do that last step of bringing Chassidus and make it practical, living with it, and living it in a way with Kabbalah's Pnei Mashiach means to accept Mashiach in the context of Rav and Melech. What is the end of the day what Mashiach is, as the Tzemach Tzedek says in Mitzvos Minei Melech? He's a Rav and a Melech. He's a teacher and an authority, and a leader, and a king. Accepting that means living by his guidelines and following his instructions. And that is essentially the job that we have today. So in that spirit, before we get into some specific questions and the connection to MyLife Chassidus Applied, I was reading a sikha from that I thought it was kedai to share. This is a sikha from 40 years ago. Tovshin Lamed Hey, Shabbos Pasha Mikate, Shabbos Chanukah. 40 years, the Rebbe says we appreciate Aboyin Shni and Koi Inu Shadaita the Rebbe. After 40 years, we appreciate things in new ways. So maybe we can appreciate this in ways we didn't necessarily fully appreciate then. It's very sharp words, but I thought it was appropriate to share in the context of what are we supposed to be doing, the Deir HaShvi, as we go from Vayechi into Shemos. As I said, Shemos, even though it begins with the Golos, but the whole Sefer is called Sefer HaGula, because the whole point of Aboyim Mitzrayim, that you read it into Mitzrayim, was Ola Naila in order for there to be the Aliyah. So even the beginning, even the first Pasuk is already considered part of the Geula, as I described. All of it is part of the Deir HaShvi, the Deir Moshe Rabbeinu, that will bring usher in the Geula. So the Rebbe is speaking, so to speak, off the record. It's on a Shabbos Fabrengen, and the Rebbe says the following words. I'm just read a little summary of it. The Rebbe speaking that Yutas Kislev, just a little introduction, was a magnum opus of a Hadan of a Rambam that the Rebbe delivered, Tavshin Lamed Hey. I remember it, many of you may remember it. The Rebbe, it was a long sikha, very complicated, and later would be published, first in the Hapardis, in the Torah magazine that Agudas HaRabbonim published, Rabbi Simcha Elberg, and then later published in a separate kuntris. The Rebbe was magiyat many times, a very fundamental sikha. It goes up there with a kuntris in Yonash Al-Teres Chassidus, which was also a sikha from Yutas Kislev Tavshin Chavav. So in Tavshin Lamed Hey, 9 years before the Rebbe would make the takon of learning Rambam, the Rebbe made this, as I said, fundamental Sim HaRambam. And the Rebbe continued it, Kochen sich Parsha Vayeshev, and then Parsha Miketz. And then the Rebbe suddenly reacts and says, I'll just translate into English so we don't have to go through twice. I went through a whole Fabrengen in Yutas Kislev, and it took a lot of Jews, and a lot of time speaking Yonim, and we spoke a Hadran in the Rambam. And so instead of the Jews being able to sit comfortably and learning or drink tea, they came to hear this Fabrengen. And what is the Teitzah? What is the result from all of this? And was kocht man sich? Only in the thing I spoke about, a certain detail about Mi Yehudi and about the Chofetz Chaim. But the Hadran of the Rambam, the Maimer Chassidus, kocht man sich bechlal nit. Even though the Maimer Chassidus is a Maimer from Afridi Kenossi. And we added some details. So the Cheder people, that's what they should be emphasizing and looking and precisely reviewing. What was the Maimer? What were the details that were added? So instead of kochen sich in Chassidus, the Rebbe bemoans how people are simply not learning Chassidus. Then the Rebbe suddenly says these words. It's 25 years already, because Tavshin Lamed Hey was 25 years from Tavshin Yud. It says 25 years since we've been speaking. And I've never heard that anybody really koch sich in any of the Maimorim or the things I say. So first I thought, and the Rebbe speaking obviously very sharply about himself, but I want to say it anyway. First I thought, Leis Svirele, that they don't like so much what I'm saying. So I started chasiding Maimer from the Frierdiker Rebbe, from the Shver. So the Chaya Rebbe, the Rebbe says. And I saw that didn't help. So I started chasiding my money from the Rebbe Nishmased, the Rebbe Rashab. And that also kocht me sich nicht. So then I thought, maybe I'm not hearing. So I sent Meraglim, like the Alter Rebbe sent spies to go hear what the Chassidim are talking between themselves. And I realized I'm correct. And then the Rebbe expresses himself like this. He says, Chassidus ist poshta geschmacke Sach zwischen andere Sachen. So for was kocht sich nicht in them? And then the Rebbe goes on and says that when we don't koch sich, what we have to koch sich, that leads to all the other problems that exist in the community and outside the community. You could all read the Sikha for yourself. I'm not saying it with all the sharp L'shenis. I just want to add another Hanoch I saw. The Rebbe also says that a number of years ago, when we were living in difficult times, in Mitzrayim, basically in the Soviet Union, there, we get out of it to try to learn a Maimer Chassidus. The Rebbe says, and I thought that once we would come out from there, everyone thought, once you came out from there, I'll just give you the Loshen. Mit 30 Jotzerik is nicht gut Matzovim, haben sie gekocht in Chassidus. In not easy times, they kocht in Chassidus. They come in America, when we came to America, l'cheir adrabah, it's ruhig begashmis. It's peaceful, physically peaceful. We can control our own destiny. So seeing the Sikha and context of my life, the bottom line is that we all know Yodeinush B'nafshe, that there's more work to be done, even those that learn Chassidus and koch zich in Chassidus. So I thought it appropriate just to get a little wake-up call from the Rebbe, a gris from 40 years ago, regards from the Rebbe 40 years ago. The words live on, Divrei Tzadikim Kayomim La'ad. And till this day, we still have to live up to this instruction. This is Miketz Shabbos Chanukah Tov Shin Lamed Hey. I also want to point out a note or two. I just saw some Tzetlach, the Chvivusa de Milsa. People love to read things from the Rebbe. So I saw one of us recently publicized an answer from the Rebbe that talks about essentially what Shlichus and Chassidus does. It's just beautiful Lashenis. The Rebbe is saying that in our time and age, where Mispar Achi Gadol, a large number of our brothers in Israel, Lachmon al-Tzlan, are sinking. Biyam shel heder yediyas hatev hamiti, in a sea of ignorance, of not knowing what is the true good. Yedias Teirasenu v'arkenu hanitzchim. A knowledge of the Torah and our value and our eternal legacy. Yedias Tafkidim be'elam. In knowing and awareness of their purpose in life. Yedias hakechas ha'atzumim v'anaylim hagnuzim behem ba'atzmam. Awareness of the tremendous, awesome resources and powers and skills that are concealed and hidden in them themselves. This is the yam. That we live in a time, just to sum it up, where people are sinking in a yam, in a sea of ignorance, of lacking all the knowledge. This is all the shenis from the Rebbe himself. The knowledge that their soul is a part of God, it's mamish. Even when, and above all, that they're not even aware that they're not aware. That's the worst of all. So this, in a situation like this, the Rebbe says, the number one priority is to go out and do everything possible to fight this ignorance. Just thought it's such sharp aces, so clearly articulated, I thought it's appropriate to share here. So it's not necessarily negated to one particular week or another. This, I think, is a universal message. And there's much more to say about this. In this settle, I'll read it another time more in detail. I just wanted to share that. One more thing that came my way that I'd like to share. Someone wrote to the Rebbe about his kashrus. He's interested in being more mekusha to the Rebbe, but he cannot do it. He can't accept the Rebbe ba'ava with love like a friend. Only as a Rebbe b'yira, with awe, with fear. Mitzad, and he writes to the Rebbe because of the Rebbe's approach, which is very intense, very gishtacha b'tekev. That's what he writes. That your approach, the Rebbe's approach, is very intense. So the Rebbe writes 2 points in response to him. Number one, on the word that he says b'yira, so the Rebbe says, Im kain hu ha'emes, if you truly, indeed, want to be mekusher b'yira with fear, yira b'b'teira mitzvahs or b'yira shemayim. You'll increase in teira and mitzvahs and yira shemayim. And that, what he writes to the Rebbe, that the Rebbe's approach is very tough or intense, however you translate b'tekev. The Rebbe writes, he writes a question mark and an exclamation point, meaning wonder, like surprise that you're writing this. Ein yedu li aderech ze klal, or al dvar ze klal. I am completely unaware of what you're writing, that I have this type of approach. Well, b'chlal, the Rebbe adds, and in general, einani machriach es mishahu b'mashahu. I do not force anybody to do anything. Just thought it's very powerful, because we've talked about this theme many times, the Rebbe Aveda b'kayach atzmei, that the Rebbe's approach was to tell us what the message is, to tell us what the mission is, but always leaving one step. The key is in our hands, but you have to turn the key and open the door. You have to make a move. At least the etzbek tana, small finger. And just interesting how the Rebbe responds here in that context. And finally, one more thing that I saw. There was a girl who was in the hospital, and a young girl, and she was in the hospital, and she needed to have serious surgery. And even though it was a difficult situation, what she did was she influenced the doctor to put on film. When she wrote to the Rebbe answered her the following. She, Pella Godel, Sha'ikir Choser. Great surprise that the main thing is missing. What's the main thing? Through this experience of this girl's, a Jew for the first time saw what is a chassid. V'dafka naira be'atzas abris. Dafka a young girl in America, hamadaberet English kemoihu, that speaks English like him, like the doctor. And though she's struggling through the deepest, and though she has all these terrible pains that she's suffering from, she makes an effort to talk to him not about healing, but to explain to him what Yiddishkeit is, to the point of action, tefillin, va'ad, that he forgot that he's a doctor. He forgot about his whole existence, v'niseda, and he was awakened, b'rikus kol machshavte. His whole mind was concentrated on one thing, what is chassidus? Mahi chassidus? Chai. He saw the living Chassidus. Chassid haya, shebetach ra b'zeh hayadus kula. He definitely saw in this, not just the mitzvah of tefillin, but he saw the effort of a girl in her pain, in a hospital where she's talking to a doctor, you think she's talking about only healing. No, you saw the whole neshama, her effort, and that's what changed and had such a deep impact on him. These are aces. This is the mission we're on. Here, God forbid, it was in the situation of a tzara. Baruch Hashem, those of us that are not in that situation, and no one should ever be in such a situation, when you're not suffering, you're not pains, how much we should be realizing that our role is the arms and legs of the Rebbe to bring Chassidus, to show Eden what Chassidus is and what a Chassid is. So if you're asking what's the Hayrah B'Peil from going over from Vayachit to Shemos, from going from the Koyach of Yosef, Me'ev Eser Shanim of Yosef, and now it's even more years than that, and the Nitzchis of Yosef into Malchus that goes into Biyah, into Elam Hazeh, Dirab Tachten Shein Tachten Lematem Meno, to show people what is a Chassid. From Achshava Dibra Maisa and showing them with the neshama, the effort, that what's Liktzi, what is she doing? She's busy influencing a Jew even when he's the doctor and she's the patient and she's suffering so greatly. So lessons can this be elaborated, I think, Ten L'chochem V'yechkem Eid. Now let us move on to the actual topics, questions that came in. We are in week 50, which is almost a year from when we began MyLife Live. And we are definitely going to be launching some new things in this, so stay tuned to some exciting news. But if anybody has any ideas of how MyLife can be, Chassidus Applied can be expanded, please share it with us, either in the form that I mentioned before, or by email, or by phone call. I want to thank everybody for partnering with us, because this project cannot be possible without you. Even though I could speak to a camera, but someone has to listen for this to have any impact and effect. And at the same time, without your questions, without the interaction and the feedback and the critique and everything, that's what makes this thing come alive. Now, first some feedback. Please allow me to add something to the good answer you gave the young boy of 6 who wrote about us being scared. That was the last episode. So I wrote about a child who was scared, and I made some suggestions, Al Chassidus, the story, and so on. So this person writes, and I thought it was appropriate to read someone's opinion. Sugar, milchiks, and non-healthy, or call it junk foods, some consider even today's animal foods, dirty our blood and bodies. Many are toxic for the body, and just as any machine we can think of, if the pipes and mechanisms are dirty or greasy with the wrong grease, they will not function well and can even get ruined. Similar, chas v'shalom, could happen to a person. Fears, nightmares, not positive thoughts can definitely be nourished by not clean eating. I speak from experiencing. Keeping the mitzvah of caring for our body will definitely help us have healthy bodies and minds with what to fulfill all other mitzvahs. So I want to add to this that there's actually the Rebbe writes to somebody about bad dreams. Same idea, that bad dreams and monsters and so on. The Rebbe says all comes from things that you do that are from the monster within each of us, which is the Yetzer Hara. If you do things by day with the monster, that helps the monster come back to you by night and sleeping. Like the Gemara says, that you dream by night what you think about by day. So obviously eliminating any toxins, both spiritual or physical ones, is clearly also critical. Feedback 2, I so appreciate the opening of the last many classes in which you take an element of Chassidus and bring it down to earth and make it practical in our daily living. I hope that this will be a permanent fixture each week. Once again, thanks for serving us all in this most profound way. Okay. Beyond the accolades, let's now go to the first question. Thank you very much, I should say. So, education and intervening parents. Here the question is about Shalom Bayis dealing with different approaches to education. We are on shlichus and there's no local Jewish school. My wife insists on homeschooling our children. We have 5 children, ages 9 and younger. I've consulted with a specialist who's a shliach, and he said to let my wife do it her way. My father keeps pressuring me to get my kids signed up onto online school. I told him what the shliach told us. My father still insists that I become a man and take a stand and send them to online school. I'm torn as I know how much pain this is causing my father, yet I need to let my wife do it her way. Okay. I want to break the question into 2. First of all, let's deal with the Chinuch question. In general speaking, yes, the Rebbe does defer to the woman, especially a younger age, even though maybe a mitzvah on the father to be mechanech the children, but the sensitivity to the way to be mechanech, the best possible way, a mother is usually more sensitive. Unless there's something that's standing out and should be a question asked to a Rav or to Mashpia, that's a general rule. Again, every rule has its exceptions, but that's statement number one. And the mother may be more sensitive to what would work best for the children. As far as a father intervening between husband and wife in chinuch matters, as I mentioned, it's not appropriate, period. Again, unless it's a pikuach nefesh situation, the Rebbe made it very clear that parents and in-laws should not get involved in a marriage. And this includes in the education of the children. Your father, with all due respect, had the opportunity to educate you and educate your siblings, and that was his responsibility with your mother. Now it's your and your wife's responsibility. You can get his opinion, no problem. You can get his insight. But to intervene, to become a point where it's tension between your father and your wife, is altogether not appropriate in any subject. Also what your wife cooks for dinner, let alone the chinuch of your children. So in general, I would say defer to your wife, work it through. If you guys have an issue, then discuss it. Find a third party, not a family member, to discuss it with. That's the general nakuda of this. Dealing with different approach. Now, if a more complicated situation with the two parents have different standards of chinuch, not how it should be taught home or online, etc. Or should you send a child away from home, and what age you should send away, which again is a complicated matter, and mothers often are more sensitive, but this is something to be discussed. But what happens if two parents have different standards? Where one wants the child to have some secular education, let's say, another one does not, and or other examples of that nature. So that I'll leave for another episode because this is not part of this question. And that really goes into another discussion of how, first of all, fathers and mothers, husbands and wives resolve issues in general when it comes to a thing like that. And number two, what taka is the standard of chinuch? And if there's a disagreement between parents, what to do about it? I will say one thing, not to just leave a question hanging. Always have a mashpia, always have a third party. It just makes things, it diffuses the challenges, it diffuses the tensions. You can just discuss the issues in a peaceful way, because I'm sure everybody has an argument to be made and everyone has their merit. And sadly, sometimes some people have different standards, and we can learn from each other. And most importantly, try to look and defer to the Rebbe's approach. A Chassidic couple should be deferring to the Rebbe's approach and what the standard of the chinuch should be, if there is indeed an issue. Okay. Honoring in-laws. So this was an extension of this question. Last week I addressed what I just said, many of the Rebbe's letters, that in-laws should not get involved, on both sides. So here was a follow-up question to that. Towards the end of this last episode, meaning episode 49, you've correctly discussed how parents-in-law should stay out of their children's marriages, and I agree with it 1,000,000%. I also agree that criticism of a child-in-law's behavior can be dangerous even if the behavior seems serious. Which means that if an in-law, a parent, tells the daughter or their son, criticize them about their spouse, it's not a healthy thing to do. And should be avoided by all means. And if there is a real issue, you have to find third parties, neutral parties, because you create too much complication when family members of the same blood, and this I should say is also brothers and sisters, who talk against their brother-in-law or sister-in-law. Something should not be spoken to spouses. Spouses have to build their Shalom Bayis. It's sensitive, sometimes fragile, and you don't have to make things worse. If you have a positive approach, something positive to say, by all means. But to stam bareden, Lashon Hara L'chilas is b'chlal not appropriate, even when it's true. Definitely not in the case where it affects the Shalom Bayis issue. It gets into the complications, who is in control here. Many times siblings and in-laws, it becomes control issues, insecure issues. People want to show that I'm right, pride, etc., etc. So anyway, continuing this person's question, what I think, though, that also needs discussion is the respect Torah asks children to give their parents-in-laws. I'm not talking about abusive parents-in-law at all. I remember hearing in a shir given by a Chabad Rav that someone great said that being disrespectful to parents-in-law is like living in sin. I know that this generation could be having respect issues, but from my experiences and another recent story I heard about, it's not only scary but extremely sad. Some examples are not allowing the mother-in-law to be with the grandchildren, or what does one do if their child-in-law has emotional issues that are affecting the parent-in-law relationship, and most likely the marriage. Okay. Good questions. So let me say the following. Yes. First of all, kibud av v'em, some say extends even to the parents of your spouse. Not necessarily the same takeif of the seres adibris, but since your wife or your husband has to respect their parents, and you are married to this person, so for you not respecting the parents of your spouse, in effect, is somewhat compromising your spouse's respect. Now, we have to immediately exclude issues which are extreme issues like abuse, or people behaving in ways that are hepech haTorah. And the Torah says clearly, even if it's your own biological parent, first comes God, then comes a parent. A parent cannot ask you to do an aveda. Kibud av v'em is not chal, because your parents have to honor God too. And kibud av v'em, as I discussed in a previous episode a while back, is one of the seres adibris on the first luach, which is beinodin l'malkim. But regardless, it cannot overrule a Torah. So definitely, if that's even with your own parents, so definitely with in-laws, if it's something of that nature. But in the normal course of events, normal course of the day and life, yes, why should you not respect your in-laws? Even if you don't always hold from them, they're not your flesh and blood, but nevertheless, it's your spouse's in-laws, it's the grandparents of your children, and there's no reason to be cocky or to be critical. If you have feelings inside, keep them to yourself. Who says you have to always articulate them? What reason? It just creates bad blood and it creates a tension between your spouse and her parents or his parents. So absolutely, that it's just plain menschlichkeit. Why do that? And again, if it's in-laws that you don't love, fine, you can't find a way to love them, but so respect them. There's cordiality, there's menschlichkeit, there's respectable behavior, and so on and so forth. It's a common thing, and that there may be some tensions. At the end of the day, your spouse is your spouse. Her parents or his parents are not yours. So it's obvious that there may be different ways of doing things. They may have a completely different approach to life. They may have things they grew up. You didn't grow up in their home. But you know something? You and your parents could also be criticized by your wife's family, or your spouse's family, I should say, your husband or wife's family. I'm just confusing. It's always the spouse's family. Everybody has different quirks, have different styles, different approaches. Again, as long as it's not something that's destructive, which then goes into the question of what do you do to make sure nobody's hurt, then respect and cordiality is always derech eretz kodem l'Torah, across the board, even to strangers in the street, let alone to your in-laws, let alone to the grandparents of your children, etc., etc. The fact that there's a lot of chutzpah, well, people have chutzpah also to their own parents. We know kibud av v'em is not an easy mitzvah. There's much to learn from the Rebbe about it. You know, the famous story, and I'll just repeat it because it's just a beautiful story, even though it's not with in-law, but it captures the story that I heard this from Rabbi Chitrik, Olav Shalom, Rabbi Hirschel Chitrik, where in the early years, the Rebbe encouraged people who were from the old home, so to speak, to go to see the Rebbe Tzachana, who was all alone here. She writes in her diaries. She was all alone, and besides the Rebbe, she had no one. The Rebbe could not be there every day, even though the Rebbe visited her every day. But he couldn't be there all day. So the Rebbe encouraged, so he would go whenever he could go. But he always tried to go at a time when the Rebbe was not there. But once he came, and the Rebbe was taka there, as he knocked on the door, he opened the door, he saw the Rebbe was there, the Rebbe was already on his way out. But the way the Rebbe walked out was a little strange. The Rebbe fixed a sefer, fixed something in one of the shafis, and he walked out in somewhat of a strange way. Okay, fine. And he spent his time with the Rebbe Tzachana, and then came a few months later, similar story. He comes again at the time when the Rebbe is there. Again, the Rebbe is on his way out, or maybe when the Rebbe saw him, he started leaving. And again, fixing a painting, another adjustments, walking out in a strange way. This time, the Rebbe Tzachana realized that Hirschel Chittik noticed this. So when the Rebbe left, the Rebbe says to him, to Hirschel Chittik, to Rabbi Chittik, I should say, the Rebbetzin says, weiß nicht, als ich weiß, als in sein Bar Mitzvah hat mir kämlich gewiesen, sein Plätze. Rebbetzin Khan is saying that the Rebbe, doesn't know that she knows, that the Rebbe's mother knows, that since the Rebbe's Bar Mitzvah, he never showed her his back. So just to give you an example of what it means, bisl kibud av and kibud aim. So this definitely extends to the menschlichkeit, to your family dynamic, and in general, Shalom Bayis, and having a peaceful home, a peaceful environment when your in-laws come over or you go to them, or there's a simcha, or there's a party, or there's a Chanukah, or whatever it may be, a seder, is to have good blood, good vibes is always healthy for you, for your spouse, for your children. So I don't see any reason why someone should be picking fights or in any way having this type of disagreements. If there's a disagreement and it has to be addressed, you can address it privately, you can address it with third parties and so on. Now the issue of where children do not allow their in-laws to come see their children, their grandchildren that is, and in this case you bring a child-in-law that has emotional issues that are affecting the parent-in-law relationship and most likely the marriage. It's very hard to comment on this because I've dealt with this unfortunately many, many times. And sometimes people think that there are emotional issues and lav dafka, that's the case. There are times where certain children, certain spouses I should say, or a spouse, a mother, doesn't want her mother-in-law to see the children too much because she thinks the mother-in-law is very controlling or imposes her opinion and so on. And I've heard cases where the mother-in-law says, my daughter-in-law is emotionally unstable. And you find out, lav dafka the case, each one is seeing, at the end of the day, the children are under control of their parents, not their grandparents. As I just said, we have to do everything possible to include grandparents into the family dynamic. It's healthy for the family, it's healthy for the spouses, it's healthy for the children. Should there be an instance where you feel that an in-law is not healthy for your children, and for that matter, what about a parent? What happens if your own parent you feel is not healthy? It's not just an in-law issue. I understand with in-laws it may be even more because people are more distrustful because it's not your own parent, but sometimes parents can also be a pain. And we have to know whether it's entitled, you're entitled to deprive them from seeing their grandchildren or not seeing them that much. This requires absolutely 100% an objective opinion that's outside of the family dynamic. Obviously, you should discuss this with your spouse, whether it's a wife with a husband or husband with a wife, and then bring the issue not to the in-laws and not to the parents, to a third party. Because there are definitely instances where a grandparent could be maybe causing attention or causing other issues, and that has to be determined. Or can even be addressed with them as well. It's a sensitive matter. But I would not just make any unilateral moves on this end. I would do things very methodical and very deliberate. If indeed it's true that someone's a negative influence on a child, so then it'll become exposed in an objective setting. If it's just your own personal preference because you don't like your in-law, you don't like your father or mother or whatever it may be, then the question is that appropriate because you don't like them? Well, maybe it's not good, maybe it's not the right thing. We all have to look at ourselves with a little bittel and know we may not be completely right in any situation, even though we may think we're convinced. The issue of emotional issues in general, we're going to address a little further down now, a little later here, and it goes across the board. In general, how do you deal with it? Emotional issues, because it's very easy to just dismiss other people by saying they're emotionally unstable. And even if they are, is that the way to talk? Is that the way to make things better? You have to know how to speak, you have to know how to do things in productive ways. Just to dismiss people based on certain stereotypical names, and even if you have basis for it, it has to be done in a Torah-dik, a halacha-dik, a Chassidic way. At the end of the day, as I said, parents are the ones that are responsible for their children. Now, if a grandparent or an in-law, either side, from either spouse, feels parents are not responsible and they're not healthy, that's a whole other story. Then that has to be brought to professionals and questioned because you're not so sure, and then see what the story is before, because to intervene between parents and children is a very serious matter, and you have to have very serious reason to do so. So I'm just qualifying that as to just be thorough about the subject matter. But in most instances, we're not talking about such extremes, especially from these questions as a parent. It's apparent that we're talking about a situation which is more an opinion, more of a style, more of a mood, not necessarily so objectively where someone has that objective. If there is a certain type of real fear, like it is with any situation, you have to be sure that there is a fear, so you have to go discreetly and confidentially, not in the street and not to every person you meet, to one professional, and not even necessarily say names, and say, here's the situation, what's your opinion on the matter? Without slanting it, without your own twist. That's why it's important the spouses should speak to each other. You need to have sound, sober, and dispassionate discussion when you're dealing with lives, especially children's lives. Okay. Let's go a follow-up to the question of nurturing relationships. Thank you for addressing friendships in the previous episode. Does the Rebbe have any specific advice on nurturing friendships and making them stronger? Question 2. Is it worthwhile investing in rehabilitation of an old friendship if the other person is not frum. We are childhood and college best friends. Actually, I read this, so I'm not going to read it again. Question number 3, love rivalry between sisters and a couple of additional notes. Dear Rabbi Jacobson, I've been gaining so much from your Wednesday night classes and Sunday sessions. Thank you. I'm in the middle of 3 sisters. I was born with some medical issues, and my illness demanded an excessive attention and perhaps some extra bonding from parents. I was the very good kid, studious, helpful, etc. My older sister and I never formed a positive bond of friendship, love. She is highly gifted and talented, and I do love and admire her for who she is. I was the primary caretaker for my parents for many years. Since their passing a couple of years ago, and a couple of circumstantial misunderstandings, my older sister does not speak with me at all. I am in her spam folder. A younger sister is very cool. We do not see each other and hardly speak. I am still in warm touch with the older sister's children and friendly with the younger sister's children from a distance. I would like to help inspire us to be closer. I look into my own needs to grow, change, and continue to aspire to rise up, participate in Torah learning and mitzvahs, but still I do miss them and the chance to grow in our friendship and understanding. Okay. So this is a continuation of the discussion in the previous episode. I spoke then about the yesod of friendship in Chassidus, Avas Achim, friendship, the idea of having someone in this world, Knei Lecha Chaver, that you simply is a good friend, non-judgmental, you can talk to, feel comfortable, you can vent, you can just be there, feel, you will not be judged, etc. So the importance of that is critical. This, of course, I mentioned, was different than the relationship with siblings, which this spills over into, and I'll address that separately. So let me just talk more about the friendship thing. Yes, there's definitely ways of how the Rebbe suggests friendships. And that is number 1, chavrusas. You cannot imagine the power of being able to reunite or just continuing. You know, we all have classmates that we grew up with. We may have grown apart simply by proximity, by marriage, by circumstances and so on. Creating a chavrusa, simply learning together, which of course means really also communicating. Because when you learn, you talk about life. Learning sometimes spills over into applying that learning to your life is a tremendous Torah-dik and Chassidic way of maintaining a friendship. And it's a friendship that's not just we go out for a cup of coffee or to socialize, but it's bonded also in a Gedusha-dik way. This doesn't mean there isn't room to go for a walk or do other things, but in general, having type of kviyas where you do it in a designated way, once a week or once a month, but consistent. And today this can be done long distance through Skype and through the other tools that we have online. So that's one very practical way, and you cannot imagine what kind of power this has. Not immediate. Over time, this creates another we'll call another anchor in your life, another security blanket. That when things are sometimes challenging, you have someone to turn to, who you're learning with anyway. It's not like calling someone up and say, listen, I haven't talked to you in 20 years and I'm in trouble. Here you have someone that on an ongoing basis. And the more we diversify, the more we have this type of security, eggs in our baskets, the better and more powerful we can be in our lives. Because there are things that your spouse can do for you, that your children, your family, and so on. But then there's something that a friend has that has a different type of impact, as anyone who has a good friend knows. Now let's go to the sibling topic. And I should just add, and this of course, as I said, spills over also an ongoing relationship in the context of getting together from time to time, just to take a walk, just to have a cup of tea or whatever it may be, visit each other in each other's homes. Another way of doing this, I should add, is not just 2 people, it could also be a group of friends that have maybe each one alternates and hosts something in their home. These are simple things to do that don't cost much, but the investment is worth the great return of it is far, far more than the investment that you'll make into it. Regarding siblings, what can I say? Your heart breaks. My heart breaks when I hear siblings that have fallen apart. Siblings is the closest thing you have in your life. You know, when you lose a parent, and no one should ever lose a parent, you really see that. At the end of the day, this is your flesh and blood. You both come from the same source. So every time you hear siblings do not talk or don't get along, just, you know, it's like, it shatters you. It's something that should not be. And if something becomes more powerful than the sibling relationship, you know there's something wrong. Whether it's money, covet, pride, and so on. The whole point of siblings is to transcend. There's enough problems with money, covet, and pride with strangers. Don't let it seep in and toxify and contaminate the sibling relationship. Siblings is the closest thing you'll ever have in this world on an ongoing basis. And it has a certain, even though there's sibling rivalries, and I'm sure there's deep-rooted things, I'm the oldest of 5, and maybe it's easy for me to talk because I came first. But the fact of the matter is, siblings maybe have their issues, but there's the connection, the bond, is deeper than anything. That's why Rahman al-Islam, the laws of Shiva, the laws about Shiva. It's like, God forbid, you have to sit Shiva for a sibling. And no one should ever know. I'm only mentioning that just to describe the Torah's appreciation of our connection during life. We don't have to wait for that. Let us create such bonds. I would do anything possible, in my opinion, I would do anything possible to reconnect to your sister. Maybe write a letter. Maybe you apologize, even if you think the other one did wrong. Go to Fnimishur Sadin, Ma'ivir al Midesav. Overlook certain things. Carrying grudges and allowing them to fester and grow obviously just becomes stronger and stronger, and you grow apart. And the sad thing is, with siblings, you could say, okay, big thing, so I won't have a relationship. The relationship with siblings is not so dramatic, like with spouses or even with parents, but it's there. It's like a quiet, foundational element in your life. And I would do everything possible. My advice is, talk to someone, figure out what the situation was, try to find some way to reconnect. Now, sometimes the sibling just simply is the problem and just doesn't want to. Then you can't do anything about it. You can't go stop knocking on a door that doesn't open. But you have to do everything in your hand, in your part. And I would say the same thing with the sibling. Now, of course, when there's more traumatic situations and there's things that we blame each other, siblings that have really hurt each other in very serious ways, so often people want to hide, but as long as I feel angry at the other person, then I'm not at fault, when you may be very much at fault. So of course it's one of the tactics and forces of denial where you just protect yourself. If you did a real serious thing that was an abuse or some violation against your sibling, then of course it's going to be very, very difficult to break through because you don't want to be exposed as the one that did it. So you make it to know that she's the problem, he's the problem. But this again goes to bittul. And are you ready to continue living a life of a lie, a sheker, just to make yourself comfortable? That's something that no one in the world can do but you. And I can sit here and speak from my heart and tell you that try to open yourself up and come to a world that's a truthful world. But many people say, you know what, I'd rather live in a world that's not true. They're not going to say it's not true, but it's more comfortable than having to deal and address all these issues. So all I can say is do whatever is possible to connect and find someone who can really help. Sometimes a third party can be of help in this regard. Okay. Let's go over to a more complicated topic. Mental illness, shidduchim. My ex-wife has clinically diagnosed mental illness due to traumas as a young lady. But the rabbis that were familiar with the problem never said anything before or even after our wedding. The Rebbe gave her 3 brachas on 3 occasions to continue the shidduch, which I actually heard the secretary knock on the Rebbe's door and come back with the Rebbe's brachas, but never asked if I should continue or not. I asked the rabbis years later, after 3 children and years of Gehennim, their response after years of me not knowing was, what was their answer? You never asked me if she had been in a mental hospital. Now I can't find a mate because she will do anything and say anything to hurt me. Her rabbi, mashpia, and psychologists all later said she wanted to destroy me. What can I do to undo this madness? My children rarely see me because they don't want to lose out on some material benefits. She is remarried, yet still seems unaware of her negative effect on the children's lives. Shouldn't the problem of not telling people about mental or physical issues be a mandatory rabbinic revelation? How can I overcome the effects of this insane and unjust war on my soul? Question number 2. What is my obligation to disclose personal information about a history of mental illness? I'm afraid that if I share it too soon, it would ruin my chances with a person. Obviously, it is something I would eventually share with my bashet, but how soon should I bring it up? Or should it be disclosed before we even go out? Okay, and then there's a whole bunch of follow-up questions to this topic, but I want to start with these 2. And one more I should add. 1 second. Yeah, wondering if you could help. What is the Torah's view on a mentally unhealthy individual marrying and having children? Is it allowed if it will negatively affect the children? What do I do in my... Another question. There was another question that's a follow-up, but I realize there's a few more I want to read here. What do I do in my predicament? I have big Shalom Bayis problems. There are also 2 kids, 5, 3 in age, that are witnessing this. I have seriously contemplated a get. My wife suffers from depression, borderline personality disorder, and ADHD. She does take medicine for all these, but I don't ever see them working. We never really talk anymore to each other and have a life and marriage of 2 roommates living together. The mental illnesses and ADHD make my life and the kids very hard, and I am at loss on what to do. And one more question. It seems to me that the topic of mental health is avoided in the frum world. Why is it that it's such a stigma and secret when the statistics say that 10% of people have mental health issues? Well, yes. So, there's a lot to say on this topic. I will begin the discussion, and if need be, continue next week's. First of all, there has to be a distinction made between different levels of mental illness. And I've talked about this topic back in the early episodes of MyLife, especially episode number 4. So I refer you to that. I actually brought there because I just realized that there was a sikha from the Rebbe Tovshin Chai, and this brings me to make this distinction, and I'll quote it in a moment. So the distinction is between mental illnesses. I don't want to put them all into one pot. There are those that are very much possible to control with medication and therapy, with proper professional oversight. These can be controlled. I know marriages that work very well, even though there's bipolar, and there's depression, and anxiety disorders, and so on. That's as long as there is awareness, and there's acknowledgement, and there's keeping things at bay. If things get out of control, where the person who's suffering from any of these different chemical imbalances, then that's a question that a spouse has to address with a professional, done very privately and confidentially, what to do. But in very many instances, with the proper oversight, as I said, with medication and therapy, things can be under control, and therefore people can have children and not to be concerned. And I'll soon discuss this a little more from a Chassidic and Torah point of view. Then there is the situation of untreated mental illnesses, which or there are such extremes, with schizophrenia as an example, and others, that simply even with medication is not possible. Now, to say that a person like that is definitely not able to get married, I am not going to make such a statement. Only God can make that statement. This requires professional insight, professional input, to look at a situation. If, for example, someone did marry someone of that psychotic, real psychosis that is uncontrollable, then you really have to talk to a doctor and to a rabbi to get I'm not going to address that. It's not in the scope of the discussion of MyLife, Chassidus Applied. There's not a medical forum. That already goes into the category of real medical situation, just like heart issues or cancer, God forbid, yenamachla, or other diseases. It's not the scope of our discussion. We're discussing things that we have more control over, or what we can tell people to intervene, and what Chassidus adds to the picture. I already discussed about nitn reshus l'refuah l'rapes, that Torah and Chassidus give not only permission, but you have to go to a doctor when it comes to medical issues. The question is what Chassidus adds to all of this, which I'll get to in a moment. Now, when it comes to children, not just spouses, children, of course, things are far more sensitive. Because if it is established that a mother or a father is destructive to their children, but that has to be established, obviously that has to be addressed in that context. But here you have to establish that, because the closest things to children are their parents. To take a parent away from a child, or somewhat limited exposure to a child, of a parent is a very, very serious statement. And you only do that when there's really no choice, and it's an unequivocal and unanimous opinion of professionals that is the only way to help the children. Again, that's outside of the scope. What is in the scope is, what about the people who have emotional challenges and so on and so forth? So here's where I want to quote a sikha from the Rebbe. I quoted it back in episode 4, but the Rebbe actually uses the words, and he uses the lesson. He's bringing the Tipulim Chadoshim. He's talking there about new revelations in medicine that Torah have always talked about, but now medicine is beginning to discover. And the Rebbe speaks about Chela HaRuach. And the Rebbe says few different expressions. The Rebbe says nervous, mentally sick, emotionally disturbed. And the Rebbe says, if someone here is aggressive, English kenner, maybe they could find more expressions. This was Purim Tavshin Chaya. But the teichen is that there's a person who has some type of imbalance like that. So today, one of the new revelations in medicine, he says, that if you could show someone how they got to that place, the root of their illness, like knowing, awareness of it, is already have the solution. This goes back to what I said. This is where Chassidus comes into play. Chassidus teaches us the dignity and the power of a human soul. Every soul that comes to earth, absolutely every soul was sent here by God. Even when it comes into a body, that the body may be in some way challenged, whether a born diabetic, or another handicap, or another disease, the neshama is the neshama shenasati b'tahirihi. That is said by every person. Now, why Hashem makes mysteries where some people have certain illnesses and certain emotional or mental disturbances, just like some people have physical illnesses, we will never know. The stigma obviously is far deeper when it comes to emotional and mental situations, because by nature, that is far more embarrassing. You know, you see, even obviously a person who's lame, a person who's deaf, a person who's blind, God forbid, these are not exactly, they're also quite demoralizing. But for some reason, for obvious reasons, when you're not in control of your own faculties, mind and heart, it's very, very painful to see and very painful to experience. And no one should ever know of this. But to say that a person's soul has been compromised, God forbid, Chassidus brings an example of two blind parents, even born blind, which means genetically, giving birth to a seeing child. So to suggest that someone has a life sentence because of an illness, yes, they do have a challenge that others do not have, and that's part of their avodah in this world, whatever the reason may be. But to suggest that they are inferior, or to suggest that their soul is in some way lesser than others, is God forbid. So Chassidus believes in the dignity of the human spirit, even when the Rebbe spoke to that parent of an autistic child, which is an objectively diagnosed illness. Clearly the child will never have social connections, especially in severe cases. And the Rebbe said, with people that child doesn't have connections, but with God that has a direct connection with God. We have to always remember, never ever to compromise the dignity of an neshama's connection to God. So even when you're dealing with the most severe psychosis, things that are not even in person's control, their soul isn't there. That's the great tragedy, a soul that's trapped in such a prison. You can cry for that person. And that empathy and that recognition is critical. Remember, Chassidus says that every neshama coming down in the guf requires rachamim rabim, empathy. Empathy, why? Because we're trapped in a golus here, and neshama feels like it's in a prison in this world. Alachas kam v'kama, how much more so someone who has additional challenges besides the regular guf and nefesh habamish challenge. The Ep.50 tells about the Rebbe Rashab once saying, it says in the Gemara that you have to be merachim, you have to have compassion for everyone except sheita. Osel l'rachem alav. You're not allowed to have compassion for a sheita, for a fool. So the Rebbe Rashab said to the Ep.50 Rebbe, Ot, zeh, viflu rachmanis medav hob mafayidin, was the Teira zogt am metonish tom rachmanis afem. How much compassion you have to have for a person who the Teira says you're not supposed to have compassion. So that compassion should not be minimized both by professionals, by family members, by friends. And in the case where there's a spouse, remember, if your spouse indeed, God forbid, has something, and this is the person you're married to, obviously together with medical intervention and the medication and the therapy, remember that it's not that person's fault. Just like to start blaming someone that they have diabetes, or to blame someone that has another illness, a genetic illness, God forbid. You have to recognize they have unique challenges, and you have to help them get the strength to do what they have to do to fight it. You're a partner with them in it. And as long as it's under control, as I said before, that's then something that you can work with. As far as the question about shidduchim, when to tell and what to tell, look, the rule generally is like this. When you go on a shidduch, anything that's going to affect the other person's life, you have to share at some point. Does it mean you have to share before you start dating? Not necessarily. But to wait till two people are already committed emotionally and it's going to now be tortured to break apart and say, by the way, we're engaged, I want to share with you, is also shtickle geneves das. So you don't have to do it someplace in between. Not the first date, maybe the third, the fourth. When you start seeing that it's going more seriously than initially, because if it's affecting the other person's life, they have to know it. And if you have an illness that is affecting another person's life, which means even if you have it under control, you cannot keep it a secret from them. If it's something from your past, people ask, should I share everything that I did in my life, every Aveda? Well, even when you're married, you're walking down the street and you see, let's say, another woman. You have to go share every machshava zara that you have with your spouse. As long as you do not act on it and you're in control of it, absolutely not. There are many things we don't share. You share things that affect the other person. That's the key thing. Because you cannot withhold information from someone that's going to be affected by your situation. So we cannot say what date exactly, but you cannot wait till it's so-called a point of no return and then you have so-called nothing to lose. Well, you have a lot to lose because the person will say, you lied to me. You didn't say the truth. It's inappropriate, the story that you share, if indeed that was the case, that it was withheld till after marriage. Now, I know parents don't want to hide it because they're afraid their child will not be able to find a shidduch. But that gets into another discussion, which I shall continue definitely next week because we run out of time, and that is sometimes parents projecting that they have no hope for their own children hide the fact because they don't feel anyone's going to marry my child. What does that say about your confidence in your child? So we can talk more about this, and because time is limited, I really would love to have gone more, but I will just have to stop here. And again, to be Messiah on a good note, and a positive note, everybody is given strengths and to deal with any challenge that comes their way. God forbid, everyone should be protected and no one should ever know of any type of challenges or illnesses. But if indeed there is a situation, there are the strengths that we all have to deal with it. I want to conclude with the fact that we are in the month of Tevis and coming from Hey Tevis and going toward Chavdalat Tevis. And Hey Tevis follows Yutes Kislev. These significant dates. So going back to the theme I began this discussion with, is the following. Hey Tevis, that we discussed, is the celebration of the Nitzchias of a Rebbe. What is a Rebbe? And his eternity. Tzibur ein ames, because a Rebbe belongs to Chassidim. The Moshe Rabbeinu belongs to the people. Maybe that's why you could say, Lo yoda ma'ishes kfurase. People didn't know he was buried, because in the sense he's not buried. Moshe leimes. He's within us. Ma'azari b'chaim, afu b'chaim. He's within us. And in that sense, a Rebbe is with us. And that is the celebration of Hey Tevis after the following the celebration of Yutes Kislev, as we discussed. And that lives on in the Ksavim, in his words, in the Torah that he taught, and so on. So Hey Tevis is always in the weeks of Vayigash, Vayechi, these weeks, where we learn about the end of one chapter in Jewish history, the chapter of the introductory patriarchs, Avram, Yitzchak, Yankov, and then of course the Shvatim and Yosef. The end with Yosef, at the last pasuk in Vayechi, the Yosef of the generation. But that empowers us to go into Shemos, empowered that now we have a Rebbe with us. And I was thinking about it, that maybe this is a shleimah b'derech efsher. Until Moshe Rabbeinu, you don't have a Rabbeinu. The first Rebbe is born in Parsha Shemos in this week. Avram is called Avram Avinu, Yitzchak Avinu, Yaakov Avinu. Maybe there may be somewhere a reference that they're Rabbeinu, but I don't think so. I've ever seen it. Where do you find the first Rebbe? Nismala Bayis Kulei, that the whole house filled with light. Moshe Rabbeinu. So a Rebbe is born in the Deir HaShvi in our generation, a Hey Tevis, following the Vayechi, Vayigash Vayechi of the preparation. Now obviously a Rebbe doesn't come in a vacuum. He comes, followed the parents and the preparations, as I said before, from the Mittler Rebbe, that the Ovis laid out, they basically laid the ground. They were the pioneers that tread the first path. They tread the path that we can then come, and through that go through Yitzis Mitzrayim, Matan Torah, build the Mishkan, go through the Midbar. So it's the Ovis that were the pioneers that beat a new path. That was what Avram Avinu did. Echad Haya Avram. But then comes a Rebbe, the Deir HaShvi comes a Rebbe. Not to suggest, obviously by the Rabbeim, it starts from the Alter Rebbe, the Baal Shem Tov. But it's very interesting how it fits here that Yosef and the Shvatim and the Ovis, they were not called Rebbe yet. A Rebbe begins in Mitzrayim, in this Golus, where you need a Rebbe, where you need the strength to be able to be connected to something that helps us survive, and not just survive, thrive. Like we learned right in the beginning of this week's Pasha, as they were oppressed, in direct proportion to that, they proliferated and they thrived. That's our challenge. Now we know we were told we're already at the end of Golus, we're already at the end of Mitzrayim of our generation. We're at the threshold, which is the Sefer HaGeula, this chapter, and we have to do our part to finish the little parts of opening our eyes. The Nitzutzes, the Rebbe says, were refined. The sparks were already all discovered, but you still have to have a mindset. You know, they used to say about the Japanese, there were certain Japanese they found on islands, on Pacific Islands, that in 1965 they were still thought the war wasn't over, because they heard from the emperor that there's a war, and they didn't know the emperor had surrendered after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And they had to be convinced that because we lived 2,000 years, almost 2,000 years in Golus, we still can have a mindset where we're still shooting and thinking it's Golus. It's true that the mindset itself is a Golus mindset. Until we don't have a Beis HaMikdash and we don't have the Kibbutz Goliath, as the Rambam Paskins, we don't have the Geula Mashiach Vadai. But the Rebbe makes it very clear that mindset is critical today. That there's no real enemy. The only enemy is our own apathy and our own ignorance. So the Rebbe should help us, that MyLife Chassidus Applied, that we should take these lessons with the keiches that the Rebbe gives us to be able to make our way through our own blindness, the things that we ourselves cannot see, and wake up from Ani Yeshena V'libi Eir, that I am asleep but my heart is awake. This has been MyLife Chassidus Applied, episode 50. Until next week, 8 to 9 p.m., everyone should have a very illuminating, tzlachadika week. Thank you.